So another one of the buzzwords, the hot topics in education right now has to do with trauma-informed care. And school buildings are becoming certified as trauma-informed care centers. And so what this acknowledges is that there's lots of students who come to school because of trauma. Well, they don't come to school because of trauma. They come to school engaged in trauma. There's a man, Jeffrey Duncan Andrade. He's a professor at the University of San Francisco, and he had a great Harvard Review article. I'll try to put a link to it below. And I heard him speak for the first time at a conference in Denver, and since then we've corresponded. And he talks about PTSD. He, even though he teaches at the college level, he still teaches an English class at a high school in Oakland every day. And he talks about the situation of the students of his who live in these really tough neighborhoods in Oakland. And he talks about PTSD. PTSD is a term that comes from the military, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. This is soldiers coming home from overseas conflict, and they're still having effects of those traumatic events in their day-to-day lives. And this is no small thing. This is a real issue. The trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder is a new term. You know, in World War II, we called it shell shock. And his argument is that in schools, lots of students are being diagnosed as having ADHD when really they're experiencing PTSD. But it's not really PTSD because they haven't left the traumatic situations, right? So if the neighborhood or the school or the home is the source of trauma for this student, they can't escape the trauma, right? It's not like a veteran who's come home from trauma and has left the trauma. It's persistent trauma. And so we have to think about our students and their engagement in class with the question, is this student existing in trauma? I think, again, to create a context for the time that these videos are recorded, we're dealing with COVID right now. What sort of trauma have our students experienced because of a disruption of one school year? What kind of lasting effects will that have? One of the things that I'm truly blessed with right now is that I don't have small children. My children are all kind of quasi-adults, and so being able to talk to them about these issues is a pretty straightforward thing. And I kind of think my daughter, like myself, we don't mind a little social isolation. But if I was raising a 3 or a 4 or a 5 or a 7-year-old right now, there could be lots of issues. I talk to friends that are parents who are really experiencing some challenges with their young children. And so what kind of trauma is that going to leave, right? What kind of trauma does the death of a parent leave? Even the death of a grandparent, the illness of a grandparent, let alone things that would be the result of abuse or neglect. I think that I first came or became aware of how trauma affected the classroom in a real way when I was a principal. And I talked in another video about Miss St. Clair. She was the 5th grade teacher. And she had a student, and this student had attended this school where I was a principal before I was there, and he had come back. And when he was there the first time, he was living with his parents, mom and stepdad, and he had been removed from the home because of abuse. And he had gone to live with an aunt and an uncle for a period of time and had been reintegrated back home and then came back to our school. And we noticed within a very short period of time that this young man was coming to school. He was physically present in his classroom, but he was not engaged in any way. And so over the next year and a half, we made 27 calls to the Department of Family Services because as mandatory reporters, we suspected abuse. And I don't know that that student was really engaged in school over that year and a half period, right? We began to see signs of physical abuse, bruises, those kinds of things. And I think most of the time that child was spent in fear, in trauma. I think the current Pinterest saying is, we can't do the Bloom before we do the Maslow. And so when we think about the needs that our students have in the classroom, addressing needs associated with feeling safe and having their physiological needs met, so that they can be present and learning, that's something that we have to think about in today's world. If you really want to understand the impact of abuse on child, there's a series of 3 books. The last time I looked, he'd written 3 books. His name is Dave Pelzer, and he wrote a book called The Child Called It, and then some sequels to that book. I'll have links to those below as well. They are not easy books to read. I first came across A Child Called It, I think, in about the year 2000. I was a graduate student at Emporia State University in the summertime, and some friends of mine in Emporia, she's a librarian, and she gave me a copy of the book. And I started reading it during some office hours at 11 o'clock in the morning. I literally read it as I walked to the student union to get a Subway lunch. I read it while I ate. I read it when I went to the bathroom, and I was reading when I walked back to the office. I finished it about 6 that night. I didn't stop reading during that whole period of time because I knew if I stopped reading the book, I wouldn't start reading it again. It was kind of an awful book to read. I know that's not a ringing endorsement and you're not all going to rush out and get it. But if you want to understand the trauma that a student can undergo, that book is a place to start. There are lots of resources out there right now as it relates to trauma in the classroom. I'll put some links to some other books that have been recommended to me below. At Benedictine, we feel like this is a significant thing, and so for the last several semesters, we've brought in guest speakers to talk about trauma to our students. We focus field experience placements in the Leavenworth community at some schools there that have gone through the trauma training. I had 2 students do a big research project 3 years ago looking at why a school would become a trauma-informed school and what that meant and what teacher attitudes were. And so there's a lot of that research going on right now. And so I think often I think it's easy to think that I teach in a good school. I teach in a middle-class building in a suburb. And so these issues aren't present here as they might be in a building that was in a community or an area of town where there wasn't quite as much cultural capital. But I don't think that we can afford to have that perspective. I think there's very real kids and very real trauma in all school buildings, or at least there's the potential for that. So I'll put some resources there if that's something you want to read more about. I'll also create some links to some PDFs. There's an institute in Minnesota called the Search Institute, and they have developed this list over the years called the 40 Developmental Assets. And these are the developmental milestones that students should reach before they come to school, before they go to middle school. And I think it's a good idea to take a look at these, not so much because we as a 3rd grade teacher or a 5th grade teacher can influence the experiences that a child has before they come to kindergarten. Of course we can't. But I think it's good to be aware of those lists and to think about those developmental assets. And if we see holes in the development of those students, we can create social experiences and lessons, even using literature and chapter books in 3rd and 4th grade to address some of those things. So if I'm a teacher that's concerned about students in trauma, or I want to know more about trauma-informed care, A Child Called It, there'll be some other resources I post, and then a review of the Search Institute's 40 Developmental Assets.